So there it is, 16 gigabytes of dedicated graphics memory on a system running integrated graphics. So in the video on the Ryzen 5 5600G's performance in Photoshop, one of my viewers asked a question about how to take control of the onboard graphics memory. I've been wondering the same thing too. Take a look at this. In the previous video, we saw that the system adjusted the amount of dedicated VRAM according to how much total system RAM there was. On this particular system, however, you see this? The dedicated VRAM is at 512 megabytes. 512 megabytes. It doesn't matter how much system RAM there is. There is in fact a total of 64 gigabytes of system RAM, but the dedicated VRAM is at 512 megabytes. In fact, it never changes. So I've been wondering myself, just how do we take control of the dedicated VRAM? To understand how all of this works, let's take a look at what AMD have to say about what they call their unified memory architecture. Now, this video really only relates to modern AMD APUs, and we already know that their graphics processors share some of the system RAM with the operating system. The settings are controlled at least initially in BIOS, and the default state is for the control to be set to auto. This should allow the system to scale the amount of RAM dedicated to the graphics processor to an optimal amount, taking into account total system RAM available. And I completely agree with AMD that ideally, the setting should be left at this default auto setting. The problem is that some systems seem to scale the amount of dedicated graphics memory, the UMA frame buffer, as AMD calls it, intelligently, like the one I tested Photoshop on, whilst other systems do not scale at all, which is what's happening with the current system. So what's the solution? Firstly, I've got to stress again that ideally you want to leave the settings at auto, but where there is no other option, we need to drop down into BIOS and make some adjustments. On this PC, we go into Advanced, and there in the confusingly labeled NB configuration, we can change the UMA frame buffer size. The maximum allowed on all the systems I've looked at is 16 gigabytes, which choosing that would make some sense if we had, say, 64 gigabytes or 128 gigabytes of system RAM. Or we could change it to, say, 4 gigabytes out of a total of 16 gigabytes of system RAM, as the viewer was suggesting in their question. Saving the settings, we can then load up into Windows. And there we have it. Inside the Performance tab of the Task Manager, 16 gigabytes of dedicated graphics memory. Note that Windows is also showing some shared graphics memory, and precisely how this is calculated is something my research did not yet uncover. But we really need to have some control over the total. Why is that? Well, because software like Photoshop and Illustrator needs to have some minimum amount of dedicated graphics memory to enable all the features that depend on the GPU processor. Now, the place where you're going to find the UMA frame buffer settings varies from system to system. AMD themselves suggest looking in the Advanced menu of System BIOS, whilst other sources suggest a range of other places to look. Understand also that the menus in BIOS change not just from, say, Gigabyte to MSI to ASUS and other motherboard manufacturers, but also from individual motherboards made by the same manufacturer. And they can even change on the same motherboard when you update the BIOS on that individual motherboard. And understand also sometimes the manuals are not at all helpful in telling you where to find integrated graphics or UMA frame buffer settings, sometimes you'll find it just not documented anywhere at all. Guys, that's it for this very brief guide. Hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. There are more of these videos coming.